Fragile Dreams is a slow-paced adventure game about a boy seeking a mysterious girl through a desolate yet beautiful world. Recommended for those who like exploration as a supplement to world building. With a promising start, the 10-hour journey leaves it just a few steps short of being a cult classic, while still rewarding those who decide to follow along to the very end. Often is the argument of how a game can be too empty, be it either in terms of content or the actual map design. For example, Shadow of the Colossus sets to create an experience of crushing isolation that can be easily defined as the clear vision of the team behind it, the limits of the hardware, or a mix of both. Most of the complaints that I've seen over the years either are control related or how the world traversal between the bosses feels unnecessary and boring. Unfortunately, I can't corroborate this hypothesis in any way, but I do wonder if those people prefer the breadcrumb design of open world games like Breath of the Wild or Genshin Impact, where the world is filled with microtasks. If I take a stance and decide that the empty and dead qualities actually work for its narrative integrity, and therefore committing to a beautiful missing of the point in the remake, does that mean I also have to accept the open world part of No More Heroes? As you can see, it's really hard to get a definite answer for this. Just to be clear, I like all of these games, not always for the same reason, but for their own individual strengths. All of this makes me think if it's possible to make the concept of emptiness and the solitude that it brings to work in favor of a game. Exploring can't always be filled with meaningful content, as it needs its own in-between spaces to give it a real sense of depth, a time and place to reflect on a journey, without the need of interruptions for every minute of silence. While Fragile Dreams is far from being a good example in favor of this topic, it certainly does a lot with passion by fusing its gameplay flow with the intended themes of the narrative, telling the story of a boy named Seto, who faced with the sudden loss of his only family, leads him to a letter with his grandfather's final wishes. Using the mourning of a loved one as a baseline for the tone of the story, the boy travels east to the Red Tower in the distance, in search for other survivors. Not much more is given as a backstory to either, as the main focus quickly shifts to the mysterious girl that Seto meets in the beginning of his journey, pulling him through this lifeless world as he explores the remnants of a time long gone. This creates an interesting perspective, as instead of the usual adult trying to survive the usual post-apocalyptic scenario, the curiosity of the young boy is a more natural leading force to the plot, and therefore the exploration by the player.
僕は触った最低だ俺って
There's a clear final goal, but at the same time, Seto is searching for the clues to the whereabouts of the silver-haired girl, so it makes sense that he would explore his surroundings. Throughout the adventure, Seto meets with a diverse cast of unique characters, with some of them even joining momentarily for certain areas, and while it sounds like it would spoil the feeling of loneliness, it instead builds upon it. For example, right after losing sight of the mysterious girl for the first time, Seto discovers a forgotten personal frame, an interactive digital assistant inside a portable gadget that can be easily brought along with him. While you would expect something more mechanical in the type of interaction this assistant could offer, it surprisingly shows flaws like doubt and worry, presenting the setting and its surroundings with a human touch. But just as you associate it as a part of the journey, it reveals that its battery is running out, only able to offer a final message of gratitude for being spared from a forgotten existence, as it expresses feelings of regret over how much it still wanted to talk with Seto. Not dismissing the machine's humanity, he mourns the loss of the short-lived companion with a proper burial, the sorrow kindling his yearn for the warmth that he felt from the mysterious girl. This connection, this type of bond unfamiliar to the young protagonist, is further conveyed by the rewards of exploration that come in form of these mementos sprawled around the environment, which Seto can read the memories of them, imbued by the people connected to the items. Narrated in a short story format, while quite good, it never quite gets to the level of Lost Odyssey's A Thousand Years of Dreams. Still, learning how they were written by several different fans of the game made me appreciate them even more, as that one fact ties itself to the game's message of human connection. With that in mind, the game is still designed as a linear experience, confined to a certain range of areas to explore for each of the plot bits. This is mostly fine, but there are a few later sections of backtracking that can be a bit obnoxious when considering how slow the only moving speed is. Also, the game dwells too much on long dead ends, with the quality of the rewards they contain to always be of ambiguous value. Someone really looked at No More Heroes and asked how funny it would be if they did this, but multiple times. I understand that it wants to show how best everything is and how far you're traveling, but they really stretch it in the last part. They really had it in the beginning, as everything was really condensed to areas filled with great detail, but then come the underground service tunnels and patience is certainly tested. Another thing I could really go well without is the construction crane boss battle. Yes, I am still talking about Fragile Dreams and not NieR, even though the Yokotaro feel is strangely present. The game certainly looks like if Cavia somehow managed to do NieR Automata first instead of Drakengard, if that makes any sense to anyone here. I would do well without any combat really. There's a leveling system, limited inventory space, and weapons break with use, so that you're incentivized into using different ones throughout the game. But honestly, I would prefer if the game was just exploration and maybe some puzzles. Around the halfway point, I just started ignoring enemies until the game decided to use them as barriers in corridors that led to progression. Besides fighting, you get the usual over-the-shoulder camera with the Wiimote functioning as a flashlight, because that was all the rage back then. It controls mostly fine, but there are times where the cursor will pass by something that is behind the character, like a door frame or a corner, and that will make him turn and slowly start walking backwards, which was kind of annoying. That aside, the exploring segments are great, as you are rewarded for taking your time seeing all the details put into the environment that help set the world in this retro-futuristic reality where most of the technology looks from the 50s or 60s, but it's actually advanced enough to have artificial intelligence, maintaining a very mechanical feel. This is reflected in parts like the tutorials, which are designed to resemble old instruction guides, or how the map is scribbled by Seto himself and filled with little neat side notes, and the amount of unique graffiti that are drawn in every wall, even if some are just some simple scribbles with varying degrees of quality, emphasizing the game's sentiment of human imperfections. While the main theme of the story is the human condition and the yearn for one another, it's important to notice that its crux comes from such a Japanese subject that I have to wonder how this got localized in the first place. Bandai Namco usually has a good hand at releasing their titles across the world, but consider the following. Both Fragile Dreams and Tales of Grace were released in the same year, and instead of localizing the RPG with an established fanbase, they went with the original title about how difficult it is to communicate feelings through language. While at the surface this is a topic that can be globally understood, it doesn't carry the same weight that Japan puts on it, with their complex web of writings and reading systems, further mangled by years of socio-cultural shapeshifting, which this story hopes you can relate with. Imagine if a bigger title tried to push this concept for a wider audience. How bad would that be? Wait a minute. Even so, the translation seems to be good enough for what it's worth, I played it with the original Japanese voice acting, so I can't comment over the quality of the English work in its entirety, but it seemed serviceable from the first hour I replayed. For the amount of Japanese text that covers every nook and cranny of the world, they at least tried putting translation subtitles on some of them when you zoom in, but unfortunately it doesn't cover every bit of text. I guess they only did it for the important stuff, but that feels like it's based on a weird set of arbitrary rules. Adding to that interesting angle of foreign media, I was and still am surprised that this wasn't caught in some kind of controversy debacle over one particular interaction between Seto and the furtive trickster, Crow. I've seen people complain over less, and I could see this being misunderstood by its face value. While I believe the game would improve if it was further concentrated by removing the backtracking, the ending still leaves a satisfying yet open note for the player to make its own sense of what the future holds for the protagonist. Diverging for a bit here, but I would like to take this moment to talk about people's adverse reactions to certain narrative conclusions. Things like unreliable accounts of fictional truths, where the story or parts of it actually never occurred in its established world, or how the story conclusion never explains every inconsistency to the real world like it owns the player an explanation. I appreciate how cat's eyes reflect light in the same way it does in real life, but besides pointing to the strange metagame concept of fireflies surrounding interactable items, they never give a final explanation as to why that happens. Maybe, and I hope you're following me with this one, maybe there's no need to always know every single minutia. That everything doesn't need nor has a logical explanation for that final sense of closure. There's a post-mortem interview with the director where he reveals specific details like how the antagonist is actually a copy of Seto's grandfather, something that is hinted by some books if you paid enough attention, but I think it's better if things are left ambiguous as they are. There was also a single volume manga that tells a short story after the ending, which is nothing special to write about, but it's still a sweet treat to those who are really invested in the characters. In the end, Fragile Dreams is still worth checking out for yourself, though you might get discouraged to finish it by later parts. Even if presented as extremely foreign with its intrinsic Japanese values, it tells a surprisingly profound story despite its whimsical cast of characters. Another tale of the indomitable human spirit facing the indifferent cruelty of the universe that we ourselves created. One which initially presents a precognitive bleak scenario to our future as a species, but that it ends shining hope in our inevitably destructive tendencies. It might ultimately look grim, but as they say, better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all.